At the very beginning that our seminar is being recorded right now. Welcome everyone at this seminar, well, precisely Zoom seminar at the Polish Economic Society. My name is Łukasz Hart. I'm a vice president of the Polish Economic Society, and I'm also a professor of economics at the University of Warsaw. I'm to moderate today's debate, but also with us is Professor Marian Gorynia, who is the president of the society, and also Professor Elżbieta Mączyńska is also with us, now the honor president of the Polish Economic Society. Okay, so just to start, short introduction from my side. So the Polish Economic Society is a place where traditionally we discuss the most important socio-economic problems we are all facing, and without any doubt, the most important one problem we are all facing now is the brutal and cruel Russian aggression on Ukraine with devastating human consequences. But the war also has political, economic, and geopolitical consequences. For instance, how it is to impact the future of the European Union. Is German leadership in Europe still possible? Well, and also, is German leadership in Europe desirable, having in mind, the collapse of the foreign policy, German foreign policy, connected to the relations with Russia? What is the future? What the future from globalization? What's the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on the position of China in the global economy? But also, we can ask the following questions. Well, what are the limits? What are the limits of Western engagement in Ukraine? Should our solidarity with Ukraine be limitless? Or what are the limits of our solidarity with Ukraine? I can, of course, quite easily multiply such important questions. So the title of our seminar is Disentangling Consequences of Russia's Invasion on Ukraine from Interdisciplinary Perspective, and therefore we invited distinguished speakers to our seminars. We are waiting for your talks, for insights, and for your comments. First of all, let me welcome Professor Harold James. Professor Harold James, who is Claude and Laure Kelly Professor in European Studies, Professor of History and International Affairs at the Department of History at the Princeton University. Professor James is an author of numerous books and papers and essays. In his research, Professor James studies economic and financial history and also modern European history. And last but not least, he is the official historian of the International Monetary Fund. Thank you, Harold, for accepting our invitation. Thank you for being with us today at this virtual Zoom seminar of the Polish Economic Society. So Professor James will give a main talk during today's seminar. Thank you in advance for your talk. And Harold's talk will be commented by Professor Michał Łuczewski and Professor Marcin Piątkowski. A few words about our commentators. Michał Łuczewski is a professor of sociology at the University of Warsaw. He's also a deputy president of the Polskie Wielki Projekt Foundation. In his research, he focuses on social movements, sociology of values, moral capital, and politics of history. And last but not least, he is doing very interesting research on the solidarity movement here in Poland, And our second commentator, Marcin Piątkowski, Professor Marcin Piątkowski is senior economist at the World Bank, where he works with many governments around the world to improve business environment, promote innovation, and support green development. He's also an associate professor at the Koźmiński University here in Poland, in Warsaw. In his career, he was also an advisor to IMF executive director, and he's the author of very well-known and very well-known book, Europe's Growth Champion: Insights from the Economic Rise of Poland, which was published in 2018 by the Oxford University Press. Again, Marcin, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Michał, also for joining us, and thank you in advance for your comments. So the plan of the seminar is the following. First we'll have a talk by Professor James of approximately 20 to 25 minutes, and Harold's talk will be followed by two commentaries, first by Michał and then by Marcin. Thank you all again, and also I welcome all the participants of this seminar. So, Harold, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you, Łukasz. It's a really great pleasure to be with you all virtually from different parts of the world, but obviously most of you are in Poland, and to speak about the questions that Łukasz put so importantly at the beginning. I mean, this is a terrifying moment. It's a moment, as Łukasz said, of great brutality and really stunning act of aggression that doesn't really have any parallel in Europe since 1945. And so in some ways, we're back to the very bleak history of Europe in the first half of the 20th century. And I do think there are some historical analogies. I wanted to talk a little bit about those because I think in part they inform the way in which we act and that we might respond to this crisis. But let me start by thinking about what the possible outcomes might be. I think at the moment when we look at the situation, but by the way, if there's an echo coming back, maybe people who are not speaking could switch off the microphones.
Yes, please switch off your microphones if you are not speaking.
Because I'm getting this kind of echo that comes back.
Thank you.
I mean, that's a bit like the situation in the world today. It produces an echo from bad things from the past. So two scenarios, I think. The one that is most likely is that this war will go on for a very, very long time, and that there's no immediate solution to it, that it will be a mostly localized war fought out in eastern Ukraine, but with occasional attempts to divert attention from that. So there may be attacks on Kiev again, there may be attacks on Transnistria, there may be attacks on the Baltics, there may be attempts to go across, for instance, the Suwałki corridor. So there's a possibility of escalation, but by and large, the expectation of most commentators is that this war will go on for a very, very long time in a kind of stalemate. The other scenario is that it might end quickly. I think that's less realistic, but there's a possibility of that happening. And the possibility of that happening is really fundamentally to do with political action rather than with military action. If it's just a purely military event, it's going to go on and on and on. But if it's going to end in a political way, that really requires a substantial change. And that's exactly what I think is reminiscent of the First World War. The First World War was started by an act of German aggression. It was intended to be a very quick war. The German military plan was for the quick defeat of France, and then for a longer grinding down of Tsarist Russia, but Tsarist Russia would be isolated. But the idea of a quick war, which was fundamental to the German war plan, failed very, very quickly. The German army was stuck at the Battle of the Marne, and then a stalemate started. And the stalemate went on for 4.5 years. And the longer that the war went on, the more difficult it was to think of a way in which peace could be achieved, because both sides believed that the enormous sacrifices and the costs in terms of human blood, in terms of lives, but also in terms of money, needed to be justified by the outcome. So if you think of what is likely here, I think it will be a repeat, and you already see some of this, of what the belligerents on both sides tried to do in the First World War. That is, when the military situation has ground to a stalemate, they try to overthrow the other side by internal means. And the Germans were trying to push a nationalist revolution in Ireland. They were trying to prompt a rising against the British position in India. The British encouraged an Arab uprising against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The British encouraged, and then the Americans encouraged Czech nationalism, Polish nationalism, in order to try to undermine the other side. And I think you're seeing exactly this right at the moment, that the plan of Vladimir Putin is to gradually wear down the amazing Western solidarity that has emerged immediately after February the 24th. And the plan is that the longer the conflict goes on, the more the strains will appear, because there are obviously different countries with different interests in Europe. There's used to be a considerable suspicion between the United States and many European countries. That may all come back again, because, for instance, the Europeans are facing most of the economic fallout of the war. The United States is providing a lot of military assistance and presumably also intelligence assistance, but the cost in terms of the economic impact is falling on Europe, and that is likely to produce a strain. And so Mr. Putin, I believe, I obviously have no insight into exactly what he is thinking, but he is thinking, I would calculate, that inflation, the acute disruptions of supplies will produce a growing backlash against governments in Europe and in the United States. In addition to that, the war in Ukraine is producing a worldwide food shortage, which is impacting most immediately and most dramatically the Middle East. Egypt is largely dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat exports, but other countries in the Middle East, but also as far away as Asia, Indonesia has a high dependence on Ukrainian wheat as well, that you will get unrest there. And so this will blow up. The calculation, I think, might also be that the other reverse side of that will operate, that Russia simply cannot sustain the extent of the losses that it's been suffering so far, and the impact of shortages of munitions, of shortages of troops, the impact on the living standards of ordinary Russians will have an impact, and people will turn more and more against this mismanaged war of aggression. So the calculation, I think, may well be, where does regime change, as it were, happen first? Is it that Russians overthrow the leadership of Vladimir Putin and put in place something new? Is it that there might be a move to democracy in Russia? That's clearly what Mr. Putin has been terrified of for a long time. It's not a new phenomenon. I mean, this was already since the color revolutions in the mid-2000s, since the Middle Eastern revolutions in 2011, since the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi. Putin apparently is mesmerized by the story of the overthrow of Gaddafi. So both sides may be looking at a kind of political collapse as a way of ending the war. And that obviously influences also the way in which the war will be fought out. I think also you can see in the way that Russia is pushing the war at the moment, a kind of picking up of themes that have been prominent in international relations for a long, long time. So the story of trying to create influence by energy supply is one that has been going on really since the 1970s and 1980s. The discussion of the gas pipelines, the oil pipelines started in the 1970s and 1980s, and they also then were a source of tension between the United States and the Europeans, and particularly between the United States and Germany, which had a high degree of dependence on the gas lines that were being built already in the 1980s. So energy dependence is going to be one of the weapons that Vladimir Putin uses in order to try to push the disintegration of the Western alliance, of Western solidarity. And it's going to be an instrument that is applied in particular to the states that are highly dependent on Russian energy. And you've seen, I think, how this works out in Germany. But more strikingly than that, I think Putin has also learned something from American politics. And he's applying what was evolved, I think, in a moment when the US was faltering. In the 1970s, President Nixon developed what he liked to call the Madman theory of international relations. That is, that it's good to be unpredictable, and in particular, it's good to threaten that you have your finger on the trigger that will unleash nuclear war. So Nixon was using that. After 2016, Donald Trump used exactly this method in a very, very big way against possible opponents, against North Korea, where he explicitly referenced time and time again the madman theory of power, but also against allies, against South Korea, where he exactly told the trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, that he would be crazy when he was dealing with the South Koreans over a trade dispute, dealing with Europeans over a trade dispute, dealing with Canadians over a trade dispute. And this looks like, at first, a very, very successful way of undermining the other side, because I think you see it in Europe, you see it a bit in the United States, that we get terrified by the threat of escalation and by the prospect that a war, which is at the moment a localized war, will spread into a global conflict, and that spreading into a global conflict will involve the use of nuclear weapons and, as a consequence, the effective destruction of much of humanity. And the Russian television has been putting out this kind of story, and it's having its impact. It's having its impact. You can see it in the letter that the German intellectuals wrote to Chancellor Scholz to plea for not sending heavy weapons to defend Ukraine. It's evident also in the way in which the United States political and security establishment is thinking about this. And the United States at the moment, I think, is worried that we're self-deterring ourselves from effectively providing the kind of assistance that is essential in order to get a good outcome of this. So it's that Mr. Putin has really set himself up as the person who has a vision that is aimed at destroying the fundamental principles on which international order has been based, the principles of multilateralism. And he's using, in doing that, the language of multilateralism. He's saying that he's trying to stop genocide in Ukraine, or he's attacking the Nazi leadership of Ukraine. It's evident how absurd those kind of statements have been. But he's subverting, as it were, the story of globalization. So, you know, the question that you asked at the end, is globalization going to be destroyed by this? Well, I think it depends very much on the outcome of this war. If Mr. Putin is successful, yes, it will be destroyed. But I don't believe that that is likely. And I don't believe that's likely because really of the heroism of the people in Ukraine, of the Ukrainian leadership, of the Ukrainian military, but of ordinary people who are really providing very, very effective information and support in a kind of very new style of military conflict. And you know, then in the long run, I think it's also a story that globalization has had these moments of interruption in the past, but afterwards, there's been a new kind of globalization. So the 1970s, which I think has many parallels in terms of the escalation of conflict, the use of energy as a way of trying to apply blackmail. So exactly a similar kind of origin of the situation where there are price rises, scarcities. And then in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, the oil producers want to apply a kind of blackmail to Europe and the United States. At first, it looked in the 1970s as if there would be more economic nationalism and turning inwards, and many countries discussed whether they would apply protective tariffs or not. But then in the end, they see that opening up is actually the best way of overcoming supply shortages and overcoming the possibility of being blackmailed in the way that OPEC did in the 1970s, or that Russia is doing in today's world. So the big development of globalization in the late 20th century was really the result of policy decisions and opening decisions taken, most spectacularly, of course, in China, that this is the moment that Deng Xiaoping starts the reforms in the late 1970s. But I think also when I look back on the history of globalization, the middle of the 19th century, also full of conflict, full of shortages, and that's actually the age out of which a new kind of globalization emerges. So, in the end, we can be optimistic. And one of the reasons I think that we can be optimistic is also that Russia is more and more isolated in this. And I believe that what is happening in Russia will lead to the discrediting of the views, the ideology of Vladimir Putin. He will look as discredited as the ideas of Stalin or of Hitler were in the years after 1945 or 1953. The question, I think, immediately is, when we think about the political solution, is there any kind of influence that will come from China on this? You might think, and some people in the US administration present this as a war of democracies against autocracies. I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. And I think that China has a fundamental interest in maintaining an open global world. China has a fundamental interest in doing that. Maybe if Putin has succeeded in the early days in February of quickly eliminating Ukraine as a country, China would have applauded that and gone along with it. But as the war goes on, as it looks more and more misconducted, misdirected, China, I think, is seeing that it cannot afford to shackle itself to what is in effect a corpse, an intellectual corpse, a moral corpse, and that as a consequence, if we think of where the final push is going to come, maybe it will come from China, in effect, saying to Vladimir Putin that enough is enough and this war has to stop. If you want to save anything, you have to stop this war and even take substantial losses for the sake of doing that. In fact, Russia itself did something like this in 1998, when the Russian Prime Minister just told the Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, that Russia was not supporting the continuation of the war anymore. So Russia gave up on Serbia in 1998. And I believe that it is likely that China will give up on Russia. And once that happens, once Russia is isolated, there is really no way in which this war can be won. And so when I think about it, in the end, I believe that we may have a much more optimistic scenario than many people believe at the moment. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Harold, for your insightful talk. And now I would like to ask Michał Łuczewski to offer. Michał, the floor is yours. Please offer us your comments and your reaction to Harold's talk.
Thanks. As Harold said, it's a great opportunity that we can talk about that issue of the war in a global context, and that we put what for some people seems a local conflict in a global context. So I think it's very important, but I'm still thinking, about that we tried to be interrupted by I don't know, Russian trolls, and handle it wonderfully, Łukasz. So it also shows that an anxiety, that fear also is entering that room. So that's also on my mind. I will start with a personal recollection of solidarity with our Ukrainian friends. I visited for the first time Ukraine during the Orange Revolution because I wanted to be a part of that struggle for freedom. Maybe this is a Polish thing to fight for their freedom and ours, but I felt that this is my Polish moment, signature moment, and I was also pushed out from my house by my wife. So that I really felt that history repeats itself. That Polish wives, telling Polish men just to go over the border and to fight for freedom. So it's really an important country for me. Then when there was a second Maidan, I visited Ukraine once again, and I was struck that although there was no threat of Russian invasion as it is now, full-scale Russian invasion as it is now, I felt that Ukraine is just completely left alone by the West. So their problems are just their problems, they are not our problems. And I cited them, wonderful Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, who wrote a beautiful poem called A Report from the Besieged City, so raport z oblężonego miasta. And there's a fragment saying that those who suffer are always alone. And this is what I felt there, that those people who are there, they are always alone. So this brings me from the personal perspective to the global perspective that Professor James presented for us. And there were several notions that resonated with me. One was the notion of stalemate, or I would call it of being stuck. What does it mean that, what it means that there's a stalemate? What does it mean that we are stuck? And I will elaborate on that. And then next to that stalemate notion was that global vision of Professor James. So global vision that is reaching back for analogies in the history, in the history of the world, specifically in the history of the First World War, but also the Second World War was mentioned. And at the same time, that global vision not only reached out for history, but also Professor James showed us that that war in Ukraine has consequences that are global for China, for Egypt, for Indonesia. So it's not only about Poland, that part of the world, but it's in general about East and West. So what I want to underline here is that notion, two notions of stalemate and also of high stakes of that stalemate, high global stakes of that stalemate. But there was also hope, and or in Professor James' phrasing, positive optimism. I use the word hope because hope carries some drama, and this is I'm referring here to Łukasz, your ideas about the world as a place of drama. So economy for you is a place of drama, but also, of course, the social world is a place of drama. So in that drama of being stuck, there's hope, and that hope is sometimes dramatic. We cannot just count on the peaceful unfolding of history, automatic unfolding of history. There will be always drama, there will be always suffering. So three elements: longue durée, so the vision of history, the global vision, and then also the global hope. This is how I see the stakes of James' short expose. So let me, as promised, let me try to understand what does it mean, first on James' terms, to be stuck, and then on my terms. Why we are stuck? Because we are in the state of existential fear. There's a state of existential fear in the West. That's the fear of escalation of the war. But of course, this is also existential fear in that part of the world, especially in Ukraine. But that fear, that primordial fear of death, can work in two ways. On the one hand, it brings about stalemate. It brings about inaction or being stuck. On the other hand, and that's I think the case of Ukraine and Poland, it can bring about action. It can bring about resistance. It can bring about fight. So what we see is that that fear that was described by Professor James can have different outcomes in the West or in Germany, let's say, and different outcomes in that part of the world. And I think this is when we want to understand that stalemate, we have to see that fear is a double-edged sword, one could say. Then there's a question of polarization, the polarization between East and the West. So we don't want to escalate that war because of the fear, but it means that we'll just remain polarized. So this is in my terms understanding of that stalemate described by Harold James. But I would like to add another way of describing that stalemate. And actually the stalemate or inability was the subject of one great German book that was called Inability to Mourn by Alexander and Margaret Mitscherlich. That was one of the pivotal books in the German history of dealing with the past. And they described inability in general, inability of Germans in particular, to act, to mourn, to see the world in a realistic way. And one can describe that inaction, that inability to act as based, and these are my terms already, on a so-called dramatic triangle. So after the Second World War, we can, there was a dramatic triangle that emerged. One could call it a dramatic global triangle. So on the one hand, we had heroes like Russia and America and the US who liberated the world. Then on the other hand, we had perpetrators like Germans, and then we had victims like Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, and so on. And then in that dramatic triangle became institutionalized through the institutions of culture, of memory, museums, and all European countries. So Germany took over the long run the role of a perpetrator, while Russia took the role of heroes. And then there were victims like Poles and Ukrainians and Jews. And now what we are seeing is that with the coming of the war, that triangle, the dramatic triangle, is not effective anymore. So it is the reason why there is so much inability, inaction, and stalemate in that part of the world. Because it seems that Russians cannot be seen as heroes by the West anymore. But also Germany, who claimed that role of a perpetrator of the Holocaust and the atrocities of the Second World War, has to move beyond that role, so not to be a collaborator with a perpetrator that is Putin's Russia now. So you cannot just be stuck as Germany is only in the past, recollecting the past, but you have to move beyond the role of perpetrator because you will be seen as a perpetrator. So this is quite paradoxical. Germany seems to underline their sins of the past, but that politics of history in Germany seems is not working in the present because it makes them inactive on the global scale. And then we have victims, and what we see in with regard to being a victim in Ukraine especially, is that we see that they change their vision. They are not victims anymore. They are the one who can shape the history and the one who can challenge both Russia and the West. So that old dramatic triangle of memory is being changed, because it has to be changed so that we can be active once again, so we can move beyond that stalemate. And let me finish by saying what we can do to just get over that stalemate. Sometimes we are sucked by anxiety and we are overwhelmed with fear. Our presence is then very anxious. And I think this is the case in some of Western countries. On the other hand, we are emotionally cut off from that anxiety. We are emotionally cut off from the war. We don't want to think about the war. And it also is the case, I think, in the Western countries. But what we can do is what I call to be present in a non-anxious way. So we understand the direness of reality, the atrocities that are perpetrated by Russians, but still we are present in a deep way for people who are fighting in Ukraine. So we are not sucked by the anxiety, neither we are distancing ourselves. We are just present there. And this is also why and how we can build solidarity. So solidarity is not distancing ourselves, but it's not also being sucked in by anxiety. We can be we can support Ukrainians not just by going crazy and trying to save the world, to become a madman, a rebour, to use Professor James' phrase. But what we can do is just also to understand also our limits. And there's, as Łukasz said, and there's nothing wrong in understanding our limits, also our limits of compassion. And once we understand our limits, we can build solidarity that is more realistic, solidarity that is more present and is not sucked in by anxiety that is now all over the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Michał, for very interesting comments and very interesting perspective. Now, Marcin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the invite. The topic is obviously timely, and it's an honor and privilege to share some comments based on Professor Harold James' introduction. And I do know Ukraine a little bit. I actually worked on Ukraine before. I led a large World Bank project in Ukraine in 2014 and 15. So I was responsible of advising the government of Ukraine on how to reform the private sector. And I remember coming away with thinking that the reform of Ukraine will be much tougher, much more difficult than I thought, for a variety of reasons. But we can keep it separately. The comments that I want to share, and then please, I just want to make sure that everyone understands that my comments will be fully affiliated with Koźmiński University and nothing affiliated with the World Bank. I have three comments on Russia, on China, and on the West. So first on Russia, and I also benefited from having read what Professor Harold James had shared before the Zoom, some background fascinating articles and op-eds that he commissioned. And I think what he said about Russia and the nature of Russian attack, he had this really nice quote when he said that imperialism is for losers. And I think what he meant by it is that he looked at the history of France, UK, and other empires, which actually started to, in his view, expand as a way to make up for their deficiencies and perceived decline in their power. And I think it's very, useful analogy for Russia also. I would actually take it even one step broader, and I would say that it's, again, I'm simplifying, exaggerating, but you could say that imperialism has always been Russia's competitive advantage. When you really think about what the country has been contributing over the last few hundred years, at least 300 years, it's been mostly what Russia has been most successful in. So that's, I think, much in line with Professor was arguing. But what comes next, I think, and let me be hawkish here, I think the world can afford to live without Russia. There's no obvious reason why the world would continue, economically at least, would continue to be connected. I think Russia is only 3% of global GDP. The only thing that the world needs from Russia has been fossil fuels, but we all know that the days are counted for when Europe and the West in particular will move away from Russian gas and Russian oil. And I think the West will not need the Russian market. It's 145 million consumers, but the Asia is growing at the pace where there will be more than almost 200 million middle-class consumers in Asia alone over the last 2 years. This will more than compensate for the loss of Russia. So overall, my bottom line on Russia is that I don't think we economically speaking, we need to worry about the economic impacts in the medium and long term of Russia's isolation. I think we can move on and not much will really happen. Now, moving to the second point on China. Point number one, I don't think China will come to Russia's rescue. And I'm saying about China, I mentioned earlier at the beginning, I actually spent 4 years in China as part of the World Bank, and I still work on China. So I know the country somewhat better than before I came to visit this beautiful country. But the bottom line is there's all indications that China is just way too worried about American and Western sanctions. And there is very little that China has actually done in practical terms to support China. And there's all kinds of examples, both at the government level, but also at the quote unquote private level. So for instance, companies like Huawei, DJI, Xiaomi, they've actually all been leaving the Russian market because they just think that the Russian market is just not attractive enough to undermine possibly the global market. So I think that's part of the equation. The other part is, and perhaps this is where I disagree somewhat with Professor James. In one of his articles, he said that Xi Jinping and China is the one that can end the war. I'm not sure. I actually think that China, first of all, is not like, I don't think they will actually want to intervene. And second, I don't think that Putin and Russia would be actually receptive to China's interventions. I think it's still very much all in Putin's hands. And one of the things, and I could talk a lot about China, but I think China is really worried because their growth model is losing steam and is probably coming to an end. The potential growth in China is now not more than 4%. The productivity growth in China is actually, or TFP growth is only around 1% per year, which is actually much slower than a lot of actually earlier Asian countries at the much higher level of development. So for instance, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan were having higher productivity growth when they were still much richer. So for China, the big problem is that the capital investment and public investment almost has negative returns. The population is declining and will be aging at a catastrophic pace pretty soon. And then the TFP growth has declined precipitously, and there's very little left. So China really cannot risk an escalation of war with the West, and I think that's how they will look at Russia in this perspective. And finally, my third point on the West and sort of deglobalization and what will happen. I think first, I think it's very likely, almost inevitable, that this deglobalization because of Ukraine's war will accelerate. I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, I live in DC every day. I talk to some of the local pundits, and I think the conclusion is that the world has sort of the liberal democracies that includes, Europe and also Japan, Korea, and a few other Asian countries, that we really have to move on. And there's a clearly two camps that have appeared, and the West will have to deal with them accordingly. And I think this process was already happening before the war. I think it will accelerate at a much bigger pace. and it will translate in particular into much faster technological decoupling. I just can't see any Western country buying, for instance, Chinese technology anytime soon, if not forever. But I think the crisis or the war in Ukraine also shows that a lot of people that argued that the West is declining and the rest of the world is rising, I think they were not necessarily right. The war has shown that the West is powerful, particularly where it acts in unity. And I think I didn't, but others tended to underestimate the West. And I, having worked on innovation in China and in a number of other countries in Europe and in Asia, my bottom line has always been that 90% plus of global progress of global civilizational and technological progress still comes from the West. So I don't think you can see much decline in terms of hardcore technologies. Even what China has done, and I could bore you for hours with details, it's very much copycats based on a hardcore technology developed in the West. So I don't see any decline in the West from that perspective. And I think Russia and China will be paying a big price for decoupling from what it is the key stream of civilizational progress still, and I think will continue to be for quite some to time. One of the, I think, impacts of this deglobalization or balkanization, if you will, is friendshoring. And I also read Harold's op-ed where he disagreed with Secretary of the Treasury, Yellen, who said that it makes economic sense to friendshore. What it means is to restructure global value chains so that more production is done in countries that are friendly to the West or to America. And Harold said that he disagrees. He thinks that better not have enemies and keep production elsewhere. As optimistic as they may be, I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's reshoring and restructuring of global value chains that happened because of COVID. It will again accelerate even more. I hear it from Europeans, I hear from Americans, I hear from everyone else. And paradoxically, for instance, Central Europe and Poland will be one of beneficiaries of this process because this is where some of this friendshoring will actually take place. So Central Europe as one of the global manufacturing hub will actually be a net beneficiary. So sort of to keep within 10 minutes, my bottom line is there's no economic problem for the world to continue to isolate Russia for years, if not decades to come, particularly when we move away from dependency on their fossil fuels, will probably a matter of a year or two. On China, I think China has kept up the rhetoric of supporting Putin, but in practical terms have really not done much, if at all, to support him because they just too worried about repercussions of picking even a bigger fight with the West. And third, the West has come out much stronger than a lot of its detractors have argued. I mean, there's all this declinism literature of the last 30 years, all these books that talk about how the West is going down the drain, and none of it, and I think the crisis has shown that it's not necessarily been the case. And I think, if anything, there will be two big camps going forward, and the whole idea and the whole strategic interest of countries like Poland will obviously to be firmly on the right side. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a truly interdisciplinary exchange between our three great speakers. And now I would like to take some questions, comments, reactions from the audience. Please, and then we'll come back to Professor James and commentators to react. But let's now give a chance to the audience to ask questions and to comment. So you can raise your virtual hand, or you can just switch on your camera, or you can just start talking and asking the question. Do we have some questions from the audience or comments? If not, I have a question, you all well, especially Martin and Professor James, you referred to China a lot. But my question again is more on Europe and especially on Germany. Well, what do you think? Especially, I'm now looking at Professor James. What do you think about the long-term implication of the situation on the position of the Germany in the European Union, about the leadership or the ability of Germany to be a leader, yes, in the European Union? What do you think, Professor James, about it? Thank you.
So I should respond now.
Yeah, I think we can start, yes, and discuss it.
Wonderful. Well, excellent question. I think there was a problem with Germany's growth model even before the Ukraine war, and the growth model depends very, very heavily on exporting a relatively limited number of products. There are machine tools. So, since the 2000s, Germany has been an enormous beneficiary of the very, very rapid growth in many emerging markets, including China, of course. And so they're exporting the machinery that is powering the growth in Brazil and India and East Asia. And then specifically on automobiles, and the automobile industry already, I think, had a sense of being in a state of crisis, because what the German model was, and this was historically really firmly anchored, was that German technology is good in making incremental improvements of a fundamentally unchanging model, but not very good in reorienting completely conceptually. And so what the Germans were doing, the German automobile producers, they were just supreme at this, of making better and better and more efficient gasoline and diesel fueled automobiles. And the challenge now is to reorient completely to a non-carbon source of energy. And some German automobile manufacturers have been experimenting with electrically driven cars, but it's clearly something that Germany is lagging behind on, and there's more revolutionary change. And I think I agree with Martin on this, that the United States is really much more of a source of fundamental innovation on that. The other areas where Germany or Central Europe have been very good in terms of fundamental research on many AI applications, but not very good in terms of translating that into actual production. So a lot of the research on artificial intelligence is done in southern Germany and Switzerland, but the big implementation of that is elsewhere. And in order to respond, Germany needs also, I think, to rethink the way in which the capital market works. It's too dependent on existing companies and not friendly enough to allowing small companies to grow very quickly as they make pioneering changes. So there's a basic problem with the German economy. Then the second element to that, and you raised that in your question, is how does a sudden political crisis like Ukraine affect the balance within the EU? And historically, in moments of crisis, just two countries really seem to be taking the basic decisions in the EU, is France and Germany. And there's some sense in which that's come back again. But you can see always, I believe, if it's a security threat, it's much more likely that France will play a greater role. France is a much more conventional power in terms of its security orientation. It's got the atomic weapons. It's got a big military presence. It can intervene effectively in Africa, in Mali, and elsewhere in Africa. It's got a tradition of doing that. And, I think also, if you just contrast styles of leadership, Mrs. Merkel and Olaf Scholz are really fundamentally very cautious people who just make small changes and don't want to be radical. And Emmanuel Macron in particular is the heir to a kind of Gaullist tradition of thinking in big terms. And it's France that's now producing the ideas about how Europe can be reoriented. So, I do think you see much more of an influence of Paris in what's going on now, also in terms of negotiations, keeping the channels open to Moscow. It was the big missions of Macron that were key in the lead up, obviously not very successful in the lead up to the Russian attack on the 24th of February. My sense of it is that this is a moment of crisis for Germany. Germany is reorienting the policy. I think it's really striking that the most effective ministers in the government are the two Green ministers. The Greens are actually also much more conscious of having a more morally driven approach to foreign policy than either the SPD, which had these very, very close ties to Russia in the past, or the CDU, which basically also managed the industrial policy in terms of Russia. So, the inspirational figures in the new government, I think, are the Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and the Economics Minister Robert Habeck, and they both really carry a sense of conviction and a sense of trying to reorient Germany in a world where values matter much more. Can I just say something that would also to
yes, please react to the comments by Marcin and Michał, of course.
And thanks to Marcin's very interesting commentary. And by the way, that also reminds me, he reminded me that I should say that, obviously, what I said is my personal opinion in every aspect, and it doesn't reflect the views of the International Monetary Fund, and doesn't reflect the views of Princeton University either. China, I think you're right on that. I mean, China is really at a moment of deep crisis, and the idea of turning to domestically fueled growth, which was very much part of the Xi agenda, has actually not worked out very well. And in fact, exports as a proportion of Chinese output have been rising over the last 2 years. So, far from reorienting itself to be more domestically focused, reorienting itself away from the world, China is more dependent on keeping the ties to the West. And we're also really dependent on China for many, many items of consumer goods, but also for something that really appeared very dramatically during the pandemic was pharmaceuticals. Even though many of the generic pharmaceuticals that we buy in Europe or in the United States are made in India, the ingredients for that come from China. And so China is accounting for something over 90% of the world's supply of antibiotics. When we're dealing with medical emergencies, and we've still got the pandemic, we're really dependent on this kind of material. And yes, I think there will be more onshoring, and that was a feature that was leading to a deglobalization over the last decade or so. It's not just a recent moment, and it's partly driven by the technology that, with something like printing, 3D printing, you can distribute production much more widely. You don't need to have the concentration of massive production in one place. And you saw, I think, indeed, for textiles, a big relocation of textile production from Asia to Eastern or Southeastern Europe, including Ukraine. So that's going on. But the point of the criticism of friendshoring was that we really can't afford a world that's divided into two blocks, and many countries don't simply want to choose that. I mean, I think you've seen in the discussion of India's attitude to the Ukraine war exactly the hesitancy, and you know, I don't think the United States should cast India out and say that India is an enemy because it didn't vote for the resolutions in the United Nations Assembly. But on the other hand, you know, we deal with all kinds of countries, and you know, the hope is that actually dealing with countries leads to a transformation, and particularly, I think, you know, Martin laid that out very well. The really severe tensions and moments of strain in China at the moment are, I think, going to lead to a questioning of the whole model of autocracy. And you know, in the same way as autocracy clearly doesn't work in Russia, in the sense that Mr. Putin is not getting good information from his advisors. People don't dare to say the truth to Putin, don't dare to say things about military developments. I think exactly the same debate is starting in China about the COVID strategy, that you know, Mr. Xi was really thinking that the zero COVID strategy had been a fantastic success, and that it demonstrated China's superiority. And I think at the moment, you're beginning to see the weakness. So, you know, I think in many countries, where there are autocracies, there will be debates about whether autocracies are effective or not. And that also is a historical thing. In the middle of the 19th century, exactly the same kind of debate. And then countries move to open up their government systems just in order to be more efficient, not in order necessarily to be more democratically legitimate, but to be efficient in a world in which the technology is changing so frequently, so fast. To be efficient in that world means that you have to open yourself up to information and to different views and to contestation. And autocracies are not very good at doing that. But that's exactly the reason that I rather shrink away from having a kind of Manichaean division of the world. I think at the moment we have one pariah state, Russia, that is an acute threat to everybody else. You know, we shouldn't think that other countries that have some kind of autocratic leadership are necessarily going to follow Russia. And I think, you know, Martin also said that and agreed with me on that one, that China can't afford to associate itself with Russia at this moment. So, you know, the hope of multilateralism is really not dead in this area.
We have a question from Marian Gorin I would like to ask. So Marian, please.
Yeah, Harold, Michał, and Marcin, thank you very much for your very interesting contributions. Really very, very interdisciplinary points of view. I would like to ask a question which is at the same time really very simple and complex. I'm an economist, so it will be an economic question. What do you think about the efficiency and effectiveness of the sanctions imposed by the West on Russia? What is your opinion? I would like to ask Harold, Michał, and Marcin, your opinions, not only one opinion, but your three opinions, if it's possible. Thank you very much in advance.
Thank you. Do we have some other questions from the audience?
Łukasz, just one thing, if I may. I really need to apologize, but I'll need to leave in about 10 minutes to catch a train. Sorry about this. So whenever I can provide some comments, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
So let's start with Martin, and then let's move to Harold and Michał. Okay, so Martin.
Yes, thank you. So very quickly, in response to Professor Gorynia's excellent question, I think the bottom line is when you look at history of sanctions over the past decades, the impacts were not necessarily that impressive, but I think they also affected different type of economies than what Russia is. And I think this time I am more optimistic on the impact of the sanctions, particularly because Russia is just so much more dependent on Western technology than other countries before. Just Russia cannot live without being a sort of absorber of spare parts, of technologies, of all the things that really kept the country going. And I've looked at various research papers and op-eds and others that pretty much looked at most industries in Russia, and there are very few, if any, that can produce anything on their own. So why I always thought that, like, for instance, looking at the exchange rate of ruble versus dollar was not a good reflection of the impact of sanctions, because ruble is not a free floating currency anymore. There's acute capital controls, and the exchange rate has nothing to do with it's not comparable to other exchange rates as we know it. It's a North Korean exchange rate, to simplify and exaggerate. So it doesn't really tell us anything anymore. But I agree with those that argue that the technological side will be really painful, because unlike China, that has developed its indigenous innovation industry, even though I would argue again, it's still not the engine of global innovation, but just an engine. Russia never had that. Russia never developed innovation of its own, all for various reasons: Dutch disease, corruption, Putin's inability to get things going. They never, the Skolkovo, the innovation city outside of Moscow, that really never became a success. There's, as we all know, there is not a single, or very few sort of innovative products and services from Russia that are in the global markets. So I think these sanctions will hurt. They will not hurt over the next month or 2 months, and we should not sort of have sleepless nights over the lack of the impact. But I think that will come, and that will retard economic growth in Russia for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor James?
Yes, I fundamentally agree with that analysis that Martin provided, that the sanctions are not immediately effective in the sense that they don't immediately restrict Russia's ability to fight war, but they are actually already biting in terms of the ability to keep the supplies going. And so, you will see the impact increasing over time. The one dimension that I would point to is it's also important to think of the end of a sanctions regime. And one of the features, for instance, for the sanctions on Iran was that, which were actually not particularly effective in terms of producing big change in the Iranian position, but also there was a lot of uncertainty about how they can be lifted. And so I think it's important to keep, at the same time as imposing sanctions, a perspective on how they can be lifted quickly if there's a change in the Russian policy and a change in the Russian government. And that's also, I think, one of the areas where this friendshoring debate makes me worried is I don't believe that Russia is eternally cast into darkness as a result of what Mr. Putin has just done. But it seems to me to be equally possible that there might be, in some years' time at least, a working democracy, a liberal, open regime in Russia. And if that's the case, the sanctions should be removed very, very quickly, and Russia needs to be taken back into the international community. And I think it's an important point that many people have been making, but it needs to be made again and again, is that this is not a war against the Russians. It's a war against a particularly gruesome, ineffective, and criminal leadership, and that is the way that we need to think of it. So the sanctions regime should also be seen as a way of trying to guide policy in a better direction in Russia. But the effects in terms of the technology are immediate, and a lot of Russian civil aviation is already crippled because of the inability to get spare aircraft parts. And that affects more things. I mean, you shouldn't imagine that shutting down the civilian economy doesn't have any military impact. It does, because you can't move the resources that you need. So the effects are already there. And sanctions, I think, are really critical. But the critical thing is probably the supply of the particular kinds of weapons, of the anti-aircraft missiles, the anti-tank missiles, the Turkish drones. Those are really important to keeping the balance in the military conflict.
Thank you, Michał. Do you have some comments?
Just briefly, what does it mean that sanctions are effective? I think that we can think about at least two dimensions. One is geographical one, so Russia, but also the West. And I would say that on the one hand, West is united, and in that sense, sanctions show that unprecedented scale of solidarity between Western countries. But there are, of course, some differences. And what is important from the Polish perspective is that that Poland and Ukraine sets the tone for those bigger countries like Germany. So it's a very rare example of bigger countries, countries of the core, that imitate smaller countries. So that's one could say, in my terms, that Polish and Polish, Central Eastern European, but also Ukrainian moral capital is then transformed into the political power in the sense that we model what is then imitated by Germany and other countries from the center. So then this is the question of Russia in this short run and the longer run. Recently, we organized a debate with the Polish ambassadors, former ambassadors to Russia. One of them was Włodzimierz Marciniak, and he said that Russians will not stop regardless of any sanctions. They will just fight, with their bare hands. So it's really hard to stop the war with sanctions. Having in mind, as Harold James put it, that Putin is representing Madman theory of leadership. So he will just, fight with bare hands. And then there's a problem. If those sanctions are effective and the Russian economy is crippled, then, and this is what Professor James alluded to, we will have problems in the longer run. So there will be resentment against the West. So if the West wins, united, then there will be problem of resentment that will be once again used by some strongmen in Russia, maybe not Putin, maybe somebody who is more refined. So this is more of a sociological take on the sanctions and the question of being effective. I hope that from economic point of view, Harold James and Marcin Piątkowski are the ones who have right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michał. Yes, Marcin?
Yeah, I just need to apologize. I need to go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. See you again.
Thank you
for inviting me, Harold. I'll catch up with you. Thank you to everyone again.
Thank you, Martin. So now I think that we have still a couple of minutes for questions. If we do not have questions from the audience, I think that we can again move to Professor James. Harold, please offer us, well, just some statements, concluding statements of this seminar, or add something you think you would like to do.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I wanted to respond also to Michał Olszewski's very, very important comments, and in the form of the debate, it had focused on the China or on the Germany or on the globalization issue. So let me come back. I mean, I think what he said is absolutely right in terms of the way in which fear can be a paralyzing influence, and the more nervous people are, the less likely they are to give an effective response to the situation. So, we need to really think very clearly and rationally about what the appropriate responses are. And in particular, some of the responses that we've had in the past, I think, were characterized by too much fear, and there is also a question of learning. So, if we think, and it's a very important part of the debate, what led to this? One of the features that I think led to Putin's choice to do the 24th of February was what had happened or what had not happened in regard to Syria, what had not happened in regard to the taking of Crimea in 2014. And in those instances, you remember in Syria, President Obama laid down some red lines and they were just ignored, and the United States didn't respond to that. And that gave the impression of weakness, and it gave the impression that you were vulnerable. So, I think, that exactly is, to me, what the heroism of Ukrainians has now done. What the heroism of President Zelensky has done is to show that there are certain circumstances in which you need to stand up and you need to think then rationally. And I think the point is right that at particular moments in history, particular countries offer a moral pattern for the rest of the world. So in the early 19th century, Greece or Poland offered a model for Europeans throughout the whole of Europe on how to think about how to organize their societies. In the 1980s, Poland offered a model, and the model, I think, very much based, and it's really appropriate to think of that at the end. When John Paul II says, "Do not be afraid, be not afraid," that is really critical. In the 1980s, there was this similar sense that you couldn't do too much because the Soviet Union would always be there. You have to be imaginative, but in order to be imaginative, you have to overcome that basic fear. But overcoming fear at the same time, you shouldn't say you abandon reason. You need to think what the best strategy is, but you need to think of the best fearless strategy. And there, I think that Ukraine has set a model, not just for Central Europe, but for the world as a whole. So we should be grateful to Ukraine.
Yes, we definitely should be grateful for Ukraine. And now, Michał, I like your point about moral capital, that moral capital we have just accumulated in Poland, in a sense, can be transformed into political capital. But I wonder whether it can be somehow transformed into economic capital. So, Michał, do you have some points to conclude?
I have to say that I'm humbled because I'm in the presence of great economists.
But you wrote a book about moral capital.
Yeah.
So you are using metaphors.
Yeah, I'm using economic metaphors. So I'm transferring economic metaphors to the realm of sociology. But whatever you say, for example, about friend shoring, then I'm translating it into my categories. So, of course, economic capital will go hand in hand with political capital, because one could say that politics is about distinguishing friend and enemy. And once you are seen as a friend, then, for example, you know that you will be supported economically. And I think this is what happens, that American companies are now investing in Poland. And from what we hear, that will be massive investments. So it shows that we are seen as friends, and Poland is seen also not only in an abstract way, but when the money are supporting those political claims, when the money is supporting the political claims, that's just realization of political capital becoming economic capital. So to address your question directly, for sure, those capitals will reinforce one another. So moral capital, economic capital, and political capital. Yeah, that's what I hope for.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we have some urgent questions or reactions from the audience. If not, so let me thank you again. It was an honor to have you here with us, Professor James. It was an honor, and thank you, Michał, also for joining us here at the Zoom seminar. I think that we had a very fruitful and very interdisciplinary intellectual exchange. I think that our debates proves that if we are confronted with very complex problems, it is really good to try to understand these problems from many perspectives, economic, sociological, and even philosophical one. So thank you again for joining us.
Tak.
Mówiliśmy ekonomista, historyk,